Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about Brazil. Today I'm joined by a Brazil-based journalist who is one of the best English language reporters on what's been going on in Brazil. He's also lived in Brazil for a really long time, unlike a lot of these parachute journalists who will show up for like a few days or a few weeks maybe to report on something that's happening. We're speaking with Brian Meir today, and Brian is the co-editor of a great website, Brazil Wire, an independent website focused on Brazil and what's actually going on the ground. Brazil Wire is really an indispensable source, and they're friends of us at the Gray Zone. They do awesome work here. You can see I have it up on the screen. It's Brazil spelled like the Portuguese way with an S, not the Yankee way with the Z. And he just reported from this protest that was happening, and that's what we're going to talk about today. On September 7th, and this is, you can see Brian's report at Brazil Wire, September 7th, the view from Brasilia, the capital. And for people who don't know, the far-right government of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil has been threatening the very fragile democracy that there is in the country. Of course, Brazil, for decades, from the 60s to the 80s, had a fascistic military dictatorship backed by the United States. And it has since had a democracy that's very fragile. And people, of course, know that the most popular president in Brazil's history, Lula da Silva, from the left-wing Workers' Party, he governed, and then his successor, Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party, was overthrown in a kind of soft coup that Brian and his colleagues at Brazil Wire have done the best job out of anyone I know in documenting the role of the United States and the FBI and the Department of Justice and the CIA in this coup that removed Dilma Rousseff from office and that prevented Lula da Silva in the last election from running as a candidate by imprisoning him on false pretenses of corruption, supposedly. So, Brian, I mean, we can talk about all of that with so-called Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, and all of that. I mean, I'm sure that most of the people watching or listening to this they're pretty vaguely familiar with a lot of that history. But of course, that history is what brought us to the current Brazilian government, the far-right government of Jair Bolsonaro, who was essentially installed through a foreign meddling operation, like what Washington claims that Russia did in the 2016 election. It's actually what the U.S. did in the 2018 election in Brazil, basically installing Jair Bolsonaro, who had been a very fringe far-right figure, into power, and doing so through what was essentially a U.S. orchestrated coup, a new kind of coup, a new generation of soft coup. And that leads us to the current government, which you, Brian, you've been living in Brazil. You've been reporting on all of the things this government has done, from mass privatizations, from totally botching COVID more than any other government on earth. In fact, there's now, I believe, over 500,000 deaths, and you can talk about COVID. And then, of course, there's also Brazil's foreign policy, which has led to Brazil joining the U.S. in trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which is a neighbor of Brazil. Brazil's become a key proxy in the proxy war against Venezuela. And there's so much we could talk about. But today, specifically, Brian, I want to start talking about what just happened on September 7th. So with all that background out of the way, for people who don't know as much as about this conflict in Brazil, can you talk about what just happened this week and why it was important?
Okay, thanks for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of Gray Zone. Basically, for weeks leading up to September 7th, key figures in the international far right were flying down to meet with Jair Bolsonaro, the president, and more importantly, his son Eduardo and his son Carlos, who are kind of intermediaries between President Bolsonaro and the international far right, the international white supremacist far right, right? So on the one hand, you had people like Jason Miller coming down, AFD parliamentarian Beatrix von Storch, who's the granddaughter of Hitler's finance minister, came to meet with Bolsonaro, the royal family, the descendants of the old monarchs who are extremely conservative, and a bunch of alt-right bloggers. I think because if the AFD holds on to parliamentary seats in the next election cycle, they're going to have their own government-funded foundation like Rosa Luxemburg or Frederick Ebert Stiftung. And I think they want to use that to exercise power in Brazil to strengthen the Brazilian far right. There's been a massive increase in neo-Nazi cells in Brazil of 600% in the last 5 years. And so all of these figures were coming down. And then Eduardo Bolsonaro flew up to Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guys, election fraud conference.
This guy's everywhere. My Pillow guy.
In South Dakota. And Steve Bannon introduced him on stage, hugged him, said, Brazil's upcoming elections are the second most important elections in the world, the most important elections in Latin American history, and Lula is the most dangerous personality on the political left in the world. All right? So all this going on, and then more people coming down to visit with the Bolsonaros during the week before September 7th, like Matthew Tyremond from Atlas Network, all coming down, all giving advice on how they can mobilize people to the streets. Because for the last year, the organized left has been working very hard to implement a series of protests. They've put over 1 million people on the streets, they've done that twice this year. The third protest was 750,000 people in dozens of cities around the country, coordinated by the unions and the social movements so that they stagger the start of each protest in each city as the cities get bigger and bigger to create this kind of like snowball effect. So they had to come out with something really big to counter these growing left-wing protests. And so we know now that this institute in Rio de Janeiro found a massive increase in Twitter bot activity by this organization. They're calling it the digital militia. And the federal police are investigating, and they believe that Carlos Bolsonaro is the Brazilian head of this digital militia. But it's got connections to Bannon, obviously Bannon's movement and things like that. So there were 81,000 tweets by bots the week before this process inviting conservatives and evangelical Christians to the protests. So they tried to create a kind of like color revolution type Egypt, Brazil 2013 effect of just like setting up this massive series of street protests. And they weren't entirely successful, but they did manage to put a lot of people on the streets, not just Rio and Sao Paulo. The city of Victoria, which only has a population in its greater metropolitan area of around 1 million, they put 10% of their population on the street, 100,000 people. 130,000 in Brasilia, about 115,000 in Sao Paulo. Not as big as they promised. They promised to bring 4 million people out across Brazil. Maybe the total number nationwide was 500,000, but it was still significant. It was big enough. And the objective of this protest was to shut down the Supreme Court. And there was a hope that was being called for by various elite businessmen and political figures, several of whom were actually arrested, that the crowd would storm into the Supreme Court and either kill or depose all 10 Supreme Court ministers.
Something that I wanted to talk about, you mentioned an important role. That's the role of business interests, because this is not just figures in the far right. In fact, you just tweeted, here I have your tweet up, fascism and big business have walked hand in hand since the days of Mussolini. Meet Marlon Bonilla, the multimillionaire owner of the ProTorque trucking company, which still has a dozen trucks parked on Brasilia's esplanade, honking and intimidating the Supreme Court. So who is this guy? And these are the trucks you can see. There are a dozen of these trucks just sitting there. Who is this guy, Marlon Bonilla? What is his truck company, and why are they intimidating the Supreme Court like that?
Well, he's a pretty big businessman who has far right sympathies and supports Bolsonaro. And one of the reasons is that he's connected to agribusiness, and Bolsonaro has basically given a green light for all the soy farmers and cattle ranchers whose products his truck company transports around Brazil to just go into indigenous reservations and start burning down trees and planting and killing people, killing indigenous people. And that's why there's a case against Bolsonaro in the International Criminal Court in The Hague for genocide right now. And so all of these people involved in the international agro commodities and mining commodities value chains are making money. So that's probably the economic reason why he supports Bolsonaro, but he's also just like a far right wing, I don't know, jerk, I guess. I mean, I've got some videos I could pull up on the screen even of these trucks, but basically the night of the 6th, they staged a kind of fake, almost like a fake coup in which nobody knew it at the time it was released to the international media. But all of these truckers, these truck companies really, because it's now come out that it wasn't individual truckers, acting as activists because they believe in this issue. It was 3 or 4 big companies that ordered some of their drivers to come onto the Capitol, onto the National Mall, which is called the Esplanade in Brasilia. Most of these truckers had permits that enabled them to come on to the National Mall at midnight, from the night of the 6th to the 7th. Yeah, you can hear the honking here if you put well, you don't have to, just imagine honking. It's not that exciting. So they had permits to come on at midnight, but, a bunch of them arrived early. They arrived at like 9:30, and they started asking the local police who were just standing there guarding, securing the area, if they could come in early. And the police kind of made a deal with them saying, look, come on in, do whatever you want. Don't go anywhere near Congress and the Senate, or the Congress and the Senate, or the Supreme Court, which are all next to each other. That saucer-shaped disc is actually the Congress building, designed by Oscar Niemeyer. And so what happened is the police opened the barricades. They came in. There were a bunch of like pro-Bolsonaro revelers, a lot of them drunk, just standing around because the mall was already open for pedestrians. And so they started cheering and following the trucks, and everyone shot these cell phone videos. You can see right here in this video, these are all the same truck company. Look at the logo there. This is called Pro Torque. It's that guy's company, and they're all like brand new. These truckers are all hired hands,
So this is the point. Is this is a well-coordinated operation because I want to talk about the attempts to make a parallel with what happened in January 6th in the U.S. I actually don't think. I don't think that comparison works very well. Clearly, the far-right people in Brazil who organized it had something in mind to January 6th, but honestly, I think this is a much bigger, much more well-coordinated operation with much more money behind it, whereas January 6th was sloppily organized, and it clearly, when they got inside the Capitol in DC, they didn't know what they were doing. They were just live streaming themselves and goofing around and being idiots. But like, it wasn't clearly this corporate backed, bankrolled operation. In Brazil, this is something that is very clearly being organized by probably the president, or at least his son, you were saying, with the backing of these corporate elements.
Yeah, and with, Steve Bannon and the international far right, obviously. I mean, they're helping a lot with the social media tactics. That's why the federal police have opened investigations against Steve Bannon and Jason Miller. They pulled Jason Miller out of the airport for questioning as he was trying to leave the country on the 7th.
You're saying that the Brazilian police have
the Brazilian federal police have opened investigations because the laws regarding freedom of speech are different in Brazil. These Americans, they think everything operates like the U.S. I think that's one of their flaws. So like stuff they were giving advice on and helping the Bolsonaro set up these Twitter bot operations and things like that, calling for a violent overthrow of the Supreme Court. That's illegal in Brazil, especially if you're a foreigner. You can't have a foreigner come in to provide logistical support on a public call to overthrow a governmental institution violently in Brazil. That's not protected by Brazilian free speech laws. Brazil's speech laws are similar to the German system. For example, in Brazil, it's illegal to be a Nazi. It's a crime. You can't walk around with a swastika on in Brazil. So the laws are different. But yeah, I think also through this ongoing communication now that's happening with these international far right actors, I feel like I'm not a specialist on the U.S. or on January 6th or something. I felt like January 6th was kind of like a mind control experiment with this QAnon stuff. They didn't care if the people actually went into the Capitol or not. They were trying to see how much they could influence people's behavior with like the most crazy theories and things like that. I felt like it was kind of like mind control, but I feel like in this moment, these actors who may have been involved in January 6th or not, whatever, Mike Lindell, obviously, and also remembering that Eduardo Bolsonaro was at that so-called War Council meeting on January 5th with Lindell and with Bannon and all the, what was like Giuliani and Sidney Powell, whoever the hell it was over there. He was at that meeting, so he was at that planning meeting. I feel like they kind of like learned from what happened right and what happened wrong. And they decided that they could get the same effect psychologically on Brazil through that happened with the Capitol invasion without actually having to invade anything. If they just staged this event the night before and let the international news cycle report on it as if there was this imminent violent overthrow of the Supreme Court about to happen. And it worked. It scared me. I was in a hotel where I was probably the only person in that hotel that wasn't a Bolsonaro supporter specifically there for that event. They were busing people in from all over rural Brazil. We now know that about 1/3 of the people who came into these protests were bused in. They were paid. Most of them were like poor farmers. One guy in the hotel asked me he was like, what is this machine? How can I get a Coca-Cola out of it? He'd never seen a vending machine before, and a couple in the elevator with me didn't know how an elevator worked in my hotel, right? So I was scared because I was surrounded by like drunk partying Bolsonaro fanatics. And I'm a public figure in Brazil. I do this web TV show with Natalia Urban that gets, not huge, but it gets like 10,000 viewers an episode and stuff. And so I actually shaved my beard. I put on some aviator sunglasses the day of the protest to go out and film, and a Chicago Cubs Chris Bryant number 17 t-shirt I bought at a thrift store in Chicago a few months ago because 17 was Bolsonaro's like ballot number, and blue is on the Brazilian flag. So I kind of like walked around filming with my smartphone because I knew if like someone had ID'd me, it could have gotten really ugly really quick in that protest, And I did actually get a death threat on the 8th when I went by, when most of the protesters on the 7th were just like families, mostly evangelical Christians, some conservative Catholics probably too. But it was a kind of peaceful atmosphere where I realized after being there for about an hour that there was not going to be any kind of incursion into any government building. They had completely locked down the area. The police were checking people's bags. There were metal detectors set up. But the next day, when there were only like 20 trucks out there honking and a couple hundred people, it was ugly. I have a friend who's a photographer for the New York Times who was almost lynched, because he was wearing a gas mask. I don't think it was a smart move on his part, and I was trying to film and someone started yelling at me, if you're from Globo, he said they're going to lynch me if they find out I'm from Globo TV, which is the right-wing Brazilian network which helped overthrow Dilma Rousseff, but is now being called communist by Bolsonaro, who also calls The Economist magazine communist.
The voice of global neoliberalism. As Vladimir Lenin said 100 years ago, the voice of the British millionaires, which are now, The Economist is the voice of the international capitalist class, billionaires. In fact, for anyone who doesn't know, at The Economist, they don't even have bylines most of the time because it's just written by this group of this elite neoliberal imperialists, and they don't need a byline because it's just whatever they all think this week. But it is incredible. It shows just how far right the politics in Brazil have shifted, at least among certain segments of the population, because there's a lot of resistance, which we'll talk about, but how even the same right-wing forces that helped lead the coup against the Workers' Party are now being deemed by Bolsonaro and his supporters to be crypto-communists. They're not sufficiently right-wing for these fascistic forces. And this gets me to a question I was going to ask you, Brian, because I think, honestly, as someone who, of course, I'm from the U.S. and I follow U.S. politics very closely, and I follow Brazil politics decently closely, I actually don't think the comparisons between Trump and Bolsonaro are very accurate. I mean, there are certainly similarities, and I get why people want to compare them, but I actually think Bolsonaro is a much more dangerous figure. Trump was always a buffoon. He was always, of course, he appealed to the far right and is a bigot and a racist and all those things, but he never was super ideological in the way that Bolsonaro is deeply ideological. For his entire career as a politician, he has been a fascistic far right fringe figure who was defending the military dictatorship, defending Pinochet. I guarantee you that Trump probably barely even knows who Pinochet is, but Bolsonaro is a Pinochet fan. Like, this guy is genuinely ideologically a fascist. And I think that he at least, we'll see how things go, but he at least has seemed a little more competent than Trump. Trump, every time he tried to do something, he was so dumb and was so able to be manipulated by the Pentagon and by police agencies that he just went along. So like when he said he was going to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, of course he never did. He said he was going to withdraw troops from Syria, and then he found out that Syria has oil, and he said, we're going to stay in Syria to take the oil. He said he would do all these things. He didn't do any of them, of course, except, of course, he cut taxes for the rich, which is, of course, Bolsonaro. He's doing the same thing. But it seems pretty clear that Bolsonaro has a very clear ideological program and is much more serious and much more competent in his plan to try to steal the election than Trump ever was. And this is an article that was published recently in Al Jazeera, and it was about comments made recently in which Bolsonaro is warned that in 2022, again, this is a year from now, he warned that there are fears of electoral fraud, as if he can tell the future somehow, and said that they have to change the laws in Brazil to defend the so-called electoral integrity because of the fears of fraud, in scare quotes. So it seems to me that he's taking a lot of different steps to try to prevent Lula, who is leading in all of the polls. All of the polls show Lula da Silva will win the election in 2022 if it's free and fair. So anyway, I mean, that was my view. And I think that the January 6th comparisons, there's some parallels, but they break down a lot. And I think that this is a much more serious attempt, an actual attempt to launch a coup. So anyway, I mean, that's my analysis. Do you agree with that? And what do you think?
I don't think he's any more competent than Donald Trump. He has a lot less charisma than Donald Trump. Donald Trump, at least he was funny. You know, at least he was funny. Bolsonaro is a dour, mean-spirited, former army paratrooper captain from the actual neo-fascist dictatorship. What makes him more dangerous is that he's put thousands of military officers, active duty and retired, into the government, including 17 cabinet ministers, including important cabinets like one called Institutional Security, which oversees all of the intelligence agencies. It's the first time there's been a Secretary of Defense who's an actual active duty general since the dictatorship. There's actually more generals in the government, in his cabinet now, than there were during the governments of the last two military dictators in Brazil. So what he's done, he's really militarized things. And so in a way, he's just like a figurehead. I mean, he acts like your racist, unpleasant uncle at a barbecue or something. But his sons are very integrated into the international far right. So they're always given these talking points, feeding them to Bolsonaro supporters and feeding them to his dad. So his dad will say things like, COVID-19 was created in a lab in Wuhan. He doesn't really think about this stuff. His sons are feeding this through communications with Bannon and those other people. And this is demonstrated.
By the way, on that point, it's funny how that talking point that used to be like a major far right talking point became like mainstream among kind of mainstream liberals in the US. Yeah. And it shows another key point that you're getting at. And this is one of the reasons I think that it's not very, I mean, there are similarities with Trump, but they break down because Bolsonaro has had bipartisan support among the US, US Republican far right and the neoliberal democratic elites, including the Biden administration right now.
Well, we know that the neoliberals will always side with a fascist over any democratic personality who challenges in any way international capitalism, especially in the third world, right? In the developing world. They'll always side. I mean, they sided with the dictatorships in Brazil. It was the Kennedy administration that started working behind the scenes to help push through the dictatorship in 1964 in Brazil. Then anybody who challenges like the ability of US corporations to come in and pay locals peanuts to suck all of their national resources out of the country is a target. That's why, I mean, even Salvador Allende, he was not a radical communist or something like that. He was someone who stood up for sovereignty, over natural resources in that country. In the Middle East, all of the secular kind of social democratic leaders like Omar Gaddafi, Yasser Arafat, even Saddam Hussein at least was secular, and had some kind of Keynesianist policies and things. All of those people just wiped out. Anyone who tries to hold on to, especially petroleum, control over the petroleum fields, we know it's just a target. And so the Democratic Party will, even though there are some people within the Democratic Party who kind of try to fight imperialism, sometimes it's because of pressure from certain unions, certain constituencies. But we see but you would probably argue it's all just controlled opposition to sheepdog.
I mean, there used to be a few anti-war Democrats. There used to be a few anti-war Democrats, but at this point, there are almost none. Like it's really incredible how pro-war the Democrats are.
But we did see like a group of around 20 constantly complaining about the coup and Lula's political imprisonment, and Hank Johnson leading this move to like open an investigation into U.S. DOJ involvement in Lula's arrest, with like 14 other lawmakers signing and stuff. That's more than you would get, I think, out of a Republican administration, but not enough to actually change anything. So then the question is it because they're good, trustworthy elected officials, or is this a strategy of controlled opposition to sheepdog leftists into the Democratic Party? I guess that's a question for Margaret Kimberly or something.
Yeah, well, anyway, the point about Bolsonaro, I think that's interesting, is looking at how this it's pretty much in broad daylight, the attempt to prepare the stage for stealing the election from Lula da Silva in a year, whether that's through an actual military coup or some kind of attempt at electoral fraud or whatever. We haven't seen the Biden administration challenge that. In fact, you and your colleagues at Brazil Wire have shown how the Biden administration has continued supporting Brazil. Of course, every now and then it'll make a comment or two lightly criticizing the Bolsonaro government, like it does to Saudi Arabia, but it's still strongly supporting the government in every actual policy that matters. And one of the policies we've seen, can you explain, is this attempt to try to change the electoral law to make it easier to do fraud next year, which I think that was also one of the reasons why on September 7th, they began targeting the Supreme Court, right?
No, that didn't pass Congress and the Senate. His attempt to change the electoral system back to paper vote. There hasn't been one proven case of electoral fraud in Brazil since they adopted this electronic system in 1996. It's pretty much hack-proof because the actual ballot boxes are all independent. They're not hooked up to any kind of network. So you might be able to hack into one ballot box, but it would be very difficult to hack into the entire system because it's. But anyway, basically, this just shows the irrationality of fascism and the irrationality of everything that's going on with this international far right. Bolsonaro refused to admit that Biden won the presidential election in the US because of the paper ballot system, because fraud in the paper ballot system in the United States. And now he's preemptively saying that there's going to be fraud. Basically, what he was saying is because they don't have an electronic system in the US, that the election was stolen, right? So now he's saying for the next election, we need a paper ballot system to guarantee that there's no fraud. It doesn't even make sense. It's just
so there's fraud in the U.S. because they don't have our system, but we need their system in order to prevent electoral fraud. No, I mean, it's incredible.
That, I mean, it's what you can do with really well-coordinated social media psyops these days. You can just convince. Yeah, I mean, he's convinced his supporters that, you know, his nickname for The Economist is the e-communist. He's convinced his supporters that the most staid and traditional institution of liberal economics for the last 150 years, founded by the guy who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, Herbert Spencer, you know, that they're communists. You know, you can just do anything these days. You could say anything. And if you market it right, yeah.
For people who don't know, The Economist, again, this is the voice of the international billionaire bourgeoisie. They openly supported the coup in Bolivia. I mean, like, they are objectively a right-wing outlet. Yeah, they're not fascist explicitly like Bolsonaro, although didn't they support Bolsonaro at first? I mean, this is also one of the ironies, is that the Wall Street Journal and a lot of these, like the so-called business press, the voices of big corporations and Wall Street, they supported the coup against Dilma Rousseff. And at first, many of them, I know the Wall Street Journal supported Bolsonaro. And then now Bolsonaro is attacking them as being crypto-communist because they're not explicitly fascist enough.
Well, you know, the reason they supported him was because of Bolsonaro's finance minister, Paulo Guedes, who is probably the most mediocre of the first generation of Milton Friedman's Chicago boys. He got his PhD under Milton Friedman at University of Chicago in the 70s. He was unable to publish his dissertation, even in Portuguese or in English, because from what I understand, it wasn't very good. And he moved to Chile after getting out of grad school to take over a university teaching position from someone who was purged by the Pinochet administration. He spent over a decade in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship making contacts with all of the Chilean far right. And he's someone who doesn't believe in the Brazilian constitution. And he's openly refused to acknowledge the constitution since it was signed. Okay, and he basically tried to liberalize the economy in the same way that the Pinochet dictatorship did. And I think The Economist feels like he hasn't been successful enough. You know, he's only managed to like raise the retirement age and sell off a lot of key public assets at pennies to the dollar. You know, like the entire public gas station system was just bought by BlackRock. And, you know, he's tied to this investment hedge fund called BTG Pactual, which is taken over. He did what Cheney did with Halliburton, right? Like he kind of resigned from BTG Pactual before entering the government, but they got the contract for the credit card system for Brazil's national bank, Banco do Brasil, at pennies on the dollar. And but he hasn't been able to push through enough really crappy deep austerity measures. And this is why The Economist turned on the Bolsonaro administration. As bad as he is, as bad as Bolsonaro is, it's not for any kind of altruism that they don't support him anymore. And I feel the same way about America's Society Council of the Americas, ASCOA, which is this think tank started by David Rockefeller in 1964, initially as Council of the Americas, when the Kennedy invited Rockefeller to create a think tank to help push through the coup in Brazil in 64. They've been involved in just about every coup in Latin America since. They were involved in the drafting of the FTAA, of NAFTA, and all of this stuff. They initially treated Guedes like a hero, and even they're souring on him now. But not that much, you know, not as much as you would think, but because everyone's worried. The bottom line is this: even though there was a full spectrum attack in the Anglosphere against the Workers' Party and the PT administration, which you had people on the left attacking them, on the center, and on the right, all at the same time, capital is terrified that Lula will be elected president again and start undoing all of these privatizations that happened since the 2016 coup, like with the petroleum and things like that. They're terrified. I mean, you can see it. If it comes down to Lula or a fascist, I believe the Democratic Party will support the fascist.
They've done it again and again in many countries. And this gets me to an article that came out recently, and this was a big deal in Brazil. you all at Brazil Wire reported on it. Of course, in English, it got almost no coverage, like always. But this was an article that was even in mainstream media, and it was about how an economist at this very powerful Spanish bank called Santander, he sent an internal report to the clients of the bank and also to fellow financial elites, in which he openly suggested that there should be a coup in Brazil to prevent Lula from winning, and he referred to Lula as a, quote, serious threat to financial interests. If he freely and fairly wins the presidential election, these bank elites, these people who work at big banks, are internally talking about launching a coup explicitly.
Yeah. And this just goes back to showing why all of these self-proclaimed vanguard leftists or Trotskyists or whatever who attacked Lula the entire time he was in the presidency for being a neoliberal, even though he raised the minimum salary from around $50 equivalent per month to $315, minimum salary repression being one of the key tenets of neoliberalism. They attacked him constantly for like betraying his supporters, not being able to push through everything he could. He was under attack the entire time. And he only had 24%. His party, the Workers' Party, had 24% of the seats in Congress. Obama had like 48% and couldn't get anything he wanted to get done, really, with 48%. So it's pretty impressive the things that the Workers' Party did manage to push through in this hostile environment, in all of these bogus corruption charges that started in 2005 with the Mensalão scandal. Everyone involved in that's been totally exonerated, except Roberto Jefferson, the guy who broke the scandal, who's a conservative politician who's back in jail now for making a couple of videos with guns threatening to invade and kill some Supreme Court ministers or something. That he's the only one who was ever really busted. The PT, some of the key strategists from the PT, like José Genuino, who was an armed guerrilla, communist guerrilla during the dictatorship in Araguaia, Pará, and was tortured and jailed and everything like that. He spent years in jail over what we now know are just like false allegations. But people like Perry Anderson spent years beating this narrative about how the Workers' Party had let down everyone in Brazil because of their corruption in the Mensalão scandal. Now everybody's been exonerated. So that was just another example of this full spectrum attack from all sides, left, right, and center, against the Workers' Party government. And we see it starting up again. Even Jacobin, which published 38 articles accusing the Workers' Party of being neoliberal between 2014 and 2017, the main coup period, they did a kind of an about face on Lula after he got arrested because they love martyrs on the left. They love talking about failures and people who died. And, they don't want to talk about, it's all individualized. They don't want to talk about collective movements that actually take power anywhere. They want to talk about this guy or that guy who said this witty thing.
They want to maintain their ideological purity. And if you take power, you have to make compromises everywhere. That's an inevitable fact of reality. And a lot of these social democratic outlets that claim, or so-called democratic socialism, which is just
it's really social democracy.
It's rebranding social democracy. It's what they're doing. They, as you've detailed, they constantly attacked Lula da Silva when he was in power in Brazil, as you showed in this article here, and in every single article they published when he was actually in power and when Dilma Rousseff was in power. And then, of course, Jacobin and these other outlets on the so-called respectable left, they attacked Evo Morales when he was president. And then after the coup against Evo, when he became a martyr, suddenly they became pro-Evo.
Oh, yeah. Oh, what a hero. What a hero he was. Like, now that he's in jail, now that Lula was in jail, we've got to, show how much we love Lula now. But the reason I brought this up, Ben, is because they're attacking him again today. They got a new article out with 3 paragraphs smearing, once again, the one thing they really like to smear is the labor unions, smearing organized labor and the Workers' Party and the organized left, which has been tirelessly fighting on all fronts, taking it to the streets. The left in Brazil set up very sophisticated media apparatus. The Cook Union Federation has its own, which is like the AFL-CIO of Brazil, but it's much farther left than the AFL-CIO. They have their own television network. They have their own radio station network, press vehicles. the left, independent left press, which is never ever quoted in Jacobin or any, the Nation or anything else, is much bigger than the U.S. So-called left press in terms of like, even if you look at like Facebook followers, Twitter followers, and stuff like that, a lot of these vehicles on the Brazilian left are like 2 or 3 times larger than Jacobin or the Nation or these other publications. So the idea that Jacobin would come out with an article right now saying that the Brazilian left is being like sedentary and it's not doing anything, when on 2 different dates this year, it's put more than 1 million people on the streets during the pandemic at a time when, 2,000 people a day were still dying of COVID because Bolsonaro's not getting the vaxes out, right? The fact that they did that is a big deal. And then just pretend that they're not doing anything. They're just sitting around waiting for Lula to get arrested, and that Lula was never that great in the first place, and this and that. It's just like, and the author of the piece is connected to Claire Fox, Spiked, Institute of Ideas, and Living Marxism Network, which is a libertarian cult that gets corporate funding, including Koch brothers funding, in the UK. I just don't understand why this guy has a voice in Jacobin to begin with. Like, why? What's the point?
I mean, we've seen again and again these like media left, social democratic outlets attack any existing forces in Latin America. I want to remind people why one of the main reasons that Lula is hated by a lot of these social democratic forces and imperialists. He actually has strongly stood with Venezuela. This is an article that I published last year at the Gray Zone I was just reporting on an interview that he did with Foro de Sao Paulo that got totally ignored, in which he openly defended the Venezuelan government and criticized the murderous U.S. sanctions. And Lula said, Europe and the United States can't recognize a fraud who declares himself to be president. He's talking about Guaido. He said, because if fashion takes over democracy, it is thrown in the garbage, and any scammer can declare themselves president. And then he also said, quote, Guaido should be in prison, and Maduro was so democratic and did not arrest him when he went to Colombia and tried to instigate an invasion of Venezuela. The one who's taking the initiative to talk is Maduro, not Guaido. Guaido would like the Americans to invade Venezuela. In fact, he even tried to force it. So what's interesting is that I think we've seen kind of 2 responses. We've seen some people try to like rehabilitate Lula after they attacked him for so long, like Jacobin did for a while, even though now they're going back to publishing attack pieces again. And they, of course, ignored the fact that Lula was defending Venezuela and Cuba. And I mean, there are contradictions. He did recently make comments that I would think are really absurd about Nicaragua that really undermine the situation where in Nicaragua, the president Daniel Ortega is facing the same kind of coup forces that overthrew the Workers' Party. But anyway, that aside, that's a long, complex discussion. But the point is that
he's not perfect at all, and he's definitely not.
But the point
I
want to get at, Brian, and I'll punt back to you, is that the thing about Lula that is not emphasized enough is that when a lot of people, especially in the US and Canada and Western Europe, when they talk about Lula, they focus exclusively on his economic program, but they don't focus on how Brazil under Lula, although certainly there's valid criticisms and there's Haiti and other things, but the fact is that under Lula and the Workers' Party, Brazil became a major voice supporting anti-imperialist movements, supporting the BRICS integration, supporting the Foro de Sao Paulo, which is, of course, founded in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And under Bolsonaro, we have seen not only massive privatization and these neoliberal economic policies, but we've seen Brazil's foreign policy has been totally subordinated to Washington. And every decision that Bolsonaro makes involving Latin America and international politics is made by the United States to such a degree that, as you showed in your reporting at Brazil Wire, that Brazil they refused to buy vaccines from Russia because the U.S. told them not to. And how many people died because they couldn't get Russian vaccines in Brazil? Because even though Brazil had an independent foreign policy under the Workers' Party and Lula, now its foreign policy is literally made by Washington.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, even Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was basically a pawn of the Democratic Party, he was like Clinton's buddy. I mean, his role was to Clintonize or Blair out the Brazilian left. That's what his party tried to do. Even he exercised more sovereignty than Bolsonaro. Like, he wouldn't have gone that far, nearly as far. He would have never like agreed to collaborate with the U.S. government on joint military activities on the border with Venezuela. He would have never put Brazil into Southcom. Even he. But Lula was someone who advocated sovereignty, and he was very good at that. And with all these contradictions of anyone taking power, like I was saying earlier, he hasn't really called himself a socialist in like 40 years or something. He's an actual, social democrat, really, basically. But in terms of sovereignty, he was a very important figure in the South. I still get emails all the time from people I know in different countries in Africa asking how Lula is because they met him at some UN conference and things like that. He had a lot of respect, and the BRICS was a really good idea. And you see now, like what's happened is Brazil has turned into this kind of like puppet state, where even though Bolsonaro considers Joe Biden to be a communist, the U.S. government is still like giving the orders. They just came down and invited Bolsonaro to join NATO, which is absurd as a global partner nation. It's just absurd.
Yeah, well, Colombia already did that.
Yeah, I know. So that's the level. Colombia is the most reactionary right-wing country in Latin America, right? So.
Yeah, it accomplished the impossible. It is even more far right and extreme than Colombia, as Hugo Chavez famously called it, the Israel of Latin America. Now Brazil. I mean, it really is. It's kind of like a neo-colony. And while we're talking about the BRICS, for people who don't know, that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This was a major attempt to try to build a new international financial architecture outside of the control of the IMF and the World Bank. And yeah, it has criticisms too, but as political economist Michael Hudson has argued, it was one of the most important creations to challenge the dictatorship of the US dollar and Washington's international financial hegemony. And here is none other than former CIA director turned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who tweeted this past January. He said, "Remember BRICS? Well, thanks to Jair Bolsonaro and Narendra Modi, the far-right prime minister of India, the B and the I, that is Brazil and India, both get that the C and the R, that is China and Russia, are threats to their people." So this is him pretty explicitly boasting that the U.S. helped to destroy the BRICS functionally. I mean, it still exists as a formal alliance, but it basically does nothing. I mean, like it doesn't actually have teeth, and it's not going to challenge the World Bank and the IMF in any way. That the U.S. used these puppets, Bolsonaro in Brazil and Narendra Modi in India, to help destroy this international institution. And I mean, I think what's interesting is that when we have this discussion about what it means to be a social democrat in the 21st century, there are people who use that both to attack and support Lula. So there are the ultra left who attack Lula for not being left wing and revolutionary enough, and then there are the social democrats in the global north who say, "Well, Lula is a social democrat just like me," but that's very different. Being a social democrat in an imperialist country, in the imperial core, is very different from being a social democrat in the periphery, in the global south. Being a social democrat in the global south, but also being an anti-imperialist, is very different from the social democrats in Europe and the US and Canada who support imperialism and support overthrowing the Cuban government and the Venezuelan government and the Nicaraguan government and the Chinese government and the Russian government and the Iranian government. The list goes on. And the Workers' Party under Brazil, certainly, there's criticisms of it, but it was a friend of anti-imperialist movements, a friend of the attempt of the ALBA in Latin America, the Bolivarian Alliance, and a friend of these, and an ally in the attempt to try to integrate Latin America, which is why Washington waged the coup against Brazil. It's why Washington orchestrated the coup in Honduras against Manuel Zelaya in 2009. It's why the U.S. had a coup basically functionally in Ecuador with Lenín Moreno. It was basically an internal coup, who was elected on a platform of supporting Correa and his program and the integration of Latin America. And that's why they're so committed to preventing Lula da Silva from coming back. And yeah, it is important to talk about the economic element, but there is a fixation, I think, on the economic element that is very economistic and that ignores the key role that Brazil, as the biggest country in Latin America, has played in international politics and was punching above its weight. Like Brazil, under the Workers' Party, was a major international power that was trying to have a seat on the United Nations Security Council, a permanent seat. And now under Bolsonaro, it's a joke. But Brazil doesn't do anything without getting permission from the U.S. It's embarrassing. Hey, you're muted. You have to.
Sorry, it is embarrassing. There's so many things I could talk about because there's so little that people actually know about what happened during the PT years in Brazil. But, like Lula went and tried to broker a peace deal with Iran, the nuclear treaty, even though, and it pissed Obama off, because he actually brokered a deal. He convinced Iran to accept the US's offer, and the US didn't want them to accept the offer. And another thing is that people don't know is that the Brazilian National Social and Economic Development Bank, which is a big engine for Keynesian kinds of development policies, stimulating internal manufacturing and production and things like that in Brazil. During the PT years, it had a bigger portfolio than the World Bank. It became the largest development bank in the world. And so there's a whole movement to try and attack that for being corrupt. There's this NGO called Connectus that has this reputation as being kind of like this Brazilian Oxfam or something like that. It was trying to have this big investigation. Bolsonaro tried to attack it for being corrupt. They're trying to, they've been trying to dismantle that bank. Its portfolio has shrunk a lot since the coup as well. But I mean, there's just all kinds of things that there's so much little things that happened during the PT years, like the law that required all public schools and hospitals in towns under 70,000 to buy 100% of their food from family farmers. At subsidized rates and things people don't even know this stuff, that they put in 1 million rainwater capture systems in the semi-arid region to mitigate climate change, or that they won an award for having the largest reduction in carbon in greenhouse gas emissions in the world. They got an award from the UN for this in 2011. People don't even know this stuff. They just think, oh, he was corrupt, or he was a neoliberal, or, it was Lula and Hugo Chavez that killed the FTAA, the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. They did that together in Cancun in 2003 or something. I mean, the Workers' Party was influential in creating the World Social Forum, where, Evo Morales met Rafael Correa and the Kirchners, before any of them even ran for president. And Pepe Mujica was there. It's degenerated into this NGO conference these days, International NGO Conference. At that time, it was a very radical kind of South-South solidarity forum that influenced a lot of political processes in the Americas. I mean, Ortega was there too. Everyone on the Latin American left used to go to that thing. And I was there in 2003 in Porto Alegre, and Hugo Chavez was there. He was the only, I was there in 2002. He was the only one besides Lula who'd actually been elected at that point. But everyone was there just strategizing together and stuff. There's all kinds of things, but now we're in this situation. I think we can get out of it, but.
Yeah, well, Brian, you mentioned the name of an organization that is not very well known outside of journalists who follow Latin America, even though it is extremely powerful, and that is ASCOA, the America Society Council of the Americas. And this, for people watching here, this document shows the international corporate partners of ASCOA. And you can see that among the international corporate partners it's a who is who of major corporations. In fact, let me get a better close-up of this image here, because it really shows this is an international corporate lobby group based in Washington that has so much influence across Latin America and has been involved in so many coups. So here it is. This is the Council of the Americas. These are the corporate members. And in order to be a corporate member, you have to donate a certain amount of money. Google, General Motors, GE, AT&T, Bank of America, Amazon, Bloomberg, BlackRock, Boeing, Kellogg, JP Morgan, Johnson & Johnson, Cargill, Cisco, Chevron, Microsoft, ConocoPhillips. I mean, every big corporation in the world. I mean, not in the world.
Chevron, Exxon, Shell, all the
Pfizer, Pepsi,
Philip Morris.
Yeah, Ford. Basically, every major North American corporation. Walmart, of course. UPS, Twitter, Uber, Shell. I mean, and I mentioned Santander, the Spanish bank. Raytheon. I mean, this is a major organization. Apple, of course. Every big North American corporation you can think of is a member of the ASCOA, American Society Council of the Americas, and it's basically a big corporate lobby, and they all work together to try to control Latin America. You mentioned it was created by the Rockefeller oligarchs, and it was created as a kind of outsourced arm of U.S. foreign policy to reassert control over Latin America, to make sure that the Salvador Allende's and the Fidel Castros and the Daniel Ortegas can't continue governing their countries, and instead it's just U.S. capital. So talk more about ASCOA's role in Brazil in specific, because I want to stress this point again. Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. I believe it's the 6th largest country on earth in terms of population. And at least before Bolsonaro, it was the 6th largest country economically. It had the 6th largest economy, although with Bolsonaro, who knows if it's really
$1 trillion a year has evaporated from the GDP since the 2016 coup. But ASCOA, right? Here's a little story about them going back. They tried to bribe the Chilean Senate to not ratify Allende's inauguration, to try and block Allende from taking power. They tried to bribe the Chilean Senate. But they have a media arm it's a magazine called America's Quarterly. It's sent out to all of the Latin American studies departments in the US, and it's available in all of the VIP airport lounges in Latin America. And the editor is a guy named Brian Winter. He's former Reuters bureau chief from Brazil. And they have a revolving door with the New York Times. So his assistant editor, Juliana Barbosa, is now the Latin American desk editor at New York Times. She was someone who really pushed the coup. Basically, ASCOA, in terms of Brazil, and the other thing is, if you want to see something really funny, go to their editor's Twitter page and start searching for him and the names of any mainstream journalist who has a left reputation. And you'll see these amazing circle jerks. I found 80 exchanges between Jacobin, editorial board member and frequent contributor Ben Fogel and Brian Winter. Vincent Bevins has had hundreds of polite exchanges with Brian Winter. He's published in America's Quarterly. Alex Quadros, who had a reputation as being a leftist until he published an article in New Yorker calling Lula's arrest the most important arrest in Brazilian history, the most important criminal conviction in Brazilian history in 2017. So all these guys who you would think are leftists.
Defending the arrest of Lula.
Yeah, defending the arrest. All these people. And there's this big Twitter circle jerk going on in which they kind of set the boundaries of what you can and can't say about Brazil. So during the whole coup period, Vincent Bevins held the position as the left voice in this circle. So you had some conservatives like Andrew Downey, and you had some people in the middle, and then Bevins was always saying, yeah, well, what about this? And then Brian Winter would shoot it down. I saw this exchange where Bevins was like, well, you would think that for the average working class or poor person in Brazil, the Brazilian public health system would actually be probably a pretty good thing. And Winter's like, no, that's a hard no. That just is ridiculous. The health system in Brazil is horrible. It's an abomination. It needs to be privatized.
Well,
they need a U.S.
For people who don't know, Brazil has had a kind of unique socialized health system for many years that is like a unique model, right? It's like community oriented.
Well, it became more community oriented during the PT years. Yeah, exactly. They have community, like Lula set up these community health agents that knock on doors and things like that. But Brazil's public health system, until Bolsonaro, even with Bolsonaro, it's still pretty good. But you have things like public maternity hospitals. Both of my sons were born in public maternity hospitals. You don't pay anything. Medicine is subsidized. Medicine's
by the way, Nicaragua's Sandinista government also built maternity houses for women who are pregnant from rural areas and poor communities to stay before they give birth, and then when they give birth. Sorry to cut you off, but that same policy exists here in Nicaragua, and the same fake left people attack the Nicaraguan government, claiming that Ortega is supposedly neoliberal. I mean, meanwhile, that thing would never exist in an actual neoliberal country like the U.S.
Yeah. In Brazil, when my son was born, I went to work the next day, and I was like, oh, I'm so tired. I was at the hospital, and they were like, you don't know you've got paternity leave? The law in Brazil, every dad gets 5 days off if his wife has a kid. It's like, I didn't even know. But all these medicines are free. HIV, antiretroviral drugs are free. The preventative work in Brazil is phenomenal. They have this vaccine system for the flu, which limits the amount of flu deaths every year to under 1,000. When in the U.S., there's like 30,000 people dying from the flu every year. And it's voluntary for people, senior citizens, and people in certain health risk areas, and they just have very good government advertising explaining why it's good to take this vaccine. And it's not, they don't force anyone to do it, but it works. So, I mean, there's all these preventative things, because when you have public medicine, obviously the government's going to try and prevent people from getting sick because it'll save them money. So, that's why everyone thought in a very racist manner in the U.S. press. I remember in the 80s, everyone thought Brazil was going to be the next South Africa or the next Haiti because it has the largest black population in the Americas and the second largest black population in the world after Nigeria. And they just assumed, oh, there's a lot of black people. AIDS is going to go through the roof there. It was a very racist assumption. But even though Brazil had about 1/6 of the GDP as the United States, per capita, the number of AIDS transmissions was less than half. It never got anywhere near, even during the worst moments of the inflation crisis in the 90s and everything, because constant ads on TV about how you can get AIDS, condoms distributed in the high schools, everywhere you go, free condoms, stuff like that. They're really good. It's a really good, I'm not saying it's like national health system in England in terms of equipment and stuff like that, but it's a very good system. Even Bolsonaro hasn't been able to destroy it. His economics minister is trying, but that's one reason why The Economist probably doesn't support them anymore, because they haven't been able to charge tuition for public universities or destroy the public health system yet.
Well, and that is largely because of the massive resistance to Bolsonaro, which over at Brazil Wire, you all have done a lot of really good reporting of a lot of the resistance. And while we wind down here and maybe the last 10, 15 minutes or so, we can talk a little bit. I want to talk about two final things before we conclude. One of them is there's something that we've kind of obliquely hinted at in this discussion so far, and that is the people who made their names attacking and demonizing the Workers' Party and Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, and then who later kind of rebranded as anti-Bolsonaro voices, even though they helped play a key role in manufacturing consent and supporting the coup, the U.S.-backed soft coup against the Workers' Party. Many of them now have rebranded as anti-Bolsonaro activists. So, it reminds me there are some similarities in the U.S. with the whole fake resistance thing, where there were people who were very viciously anti-Trump, which of course makes sense. I mean, Trump was awful in so many ways. but they didn't actually have any positive progressive program that would challenge what Trump ultimately did, because at the end of the day, Trump's political program when he actually took power was very similar to Obama's and Bush's. I mean, it was 95% identical. There were a few changes, but it was as David Petraeus, former CIA director, said. He said it in an interview. He said Trump was more continuity than change. And anyway, the point I'm saying is that there are these figures who were very much against the PT, the Workers' Party, and now are very much against Bolsonaro. And if, as we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, if Bolsonaro is unable to actually do some kind of coup, if he's unable to steal the election, and in the lead up to the election next year, Lula da Silva is allowed to participate, how do you see those forces that claim to now be anti-Bolsonaro, how do you see them positioning themselves with a choice between a return to Lula da Silva or staying with Bolsonaro?
I don't see any of those people praising Lula yet, really. They've backed off. They had to back off on calling him corrupt, obviously, because it's just ridiculous. Like, every single charge has been thrown out. It's ridiculous I mean, this is a very simple guy. He's still living in the same apartment he's been living in for like 40 years, which is in the Gary, Indiana of Sao Paulo. You know, it's like he never even moved to like a wealthy neighborhood or anything. You know, they were trying to say in the media that the federal police had confiscated his yacht during the U.S. orchestrated Lava Jato investigation, and then the prosecutors, Sergio Moro, who was put on the cover of that America's Quarterly magazine, a Ghostbusters outfit once called Corruption Buster, he was refusing to let the media see any of the things they were confiscating from Lula. So months later, it turned out that Lula's yacht was an 11-foot aluminum fishing boat in a tilapia pond. You know, like that kind of, he's a simple guy, right? But they have a hard time.
1 second, Brian. Here, this is again, America's Quarterly. This is the mouthpiece of that corporate lobbying group we were talking about, ASCOA, ASCOA. And here, who published this? Brian Winter, the editor who's a friend of the fake left, so-called Brazil experts in the corporate media. And here's this magazine issue, Corruption Busters, Latin America's top 5 corruption busters. And there you have Sergio Moro, very likely a CIA asset, who visited CIA headquarters with Bolsonaro after they were installed in power through the U.S. coup. And of course, has had a falling out with Bolsonaro, but Sergio Moro went on to be Bolsonaro's so-called super minister, right?
Yeah. So there's 7 felony investigations against Sergio Moro now for corruption, for different kinds of corruption related to judicial bias. Like, one of them being that, no, you can't, jail the leading presidential candidate and then accept a cabinet position in the guy who wins the election's government, because that's conflict of interest. Yeah. So, like, he's under investigation for that. Like, these guys in the foreign media, they just like raised an eyebrow when he accepted the position. Do you think he's doing it because he loves Brazil so much? That's what Brian Winter said. Do you think he thinks he can help control Bolsonaro? This kind of stuff. Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, yeah.
So anyway, sorry, I cut you off, but about where these people who are like the the neither nor, the people who are against Lula and Bolsonaro, where are they going to position themselves, and what will be the narrative?
Well, I think it was safe. It was safe to like soften everything on Lula when it looked like he was going to spend a few years in jail, because then he was a martyr. So then the liberal, fake left Americans could say, look, he's another one of our heroes, Well,
because he's powerless.
Because he's powerless.
They love you when you have no power. When you have power, they hate you and always criticize you.
Like Nelson Mandela was in jail and stuff like that. But there were things like, for example, Tom Phillips in The Guardian, during the month before Bolsonaro's second round election, he published like 23 articles in The Guardian softening the image of Bolsonaro. In one, he allowed Bolsonaro to compare himself to Winston Churchill, and then they used that as the headlines. Bolsonaro says he's not a fascist. he compares himself to Winston Churchill, who, was another genocidal maniac. So, I mean, maybe it wasn't that bad of a comparison, because Bolsonaro was probably thinking about starving millions of people to death in India when he compared himself to Winston Churchill.
Yeah, and look what Churchill said about Hitler. I mean, he actually admired Hitler a lot, and he saw it was a tragedy that they had to fight with Germany, Nazi Germany.
I bet. And that's another thing. So, I mean, basically, you could compare Bolsonaro to Winston Churchill, except that's not the kind of comparison that the Guardian was implying.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what I'm getting at here is, what kind of spoiler candidates could we potentially see? Specifically, there's this guy Ciro Gomez that you hear talked about a lot as like this so-called midway between Bolsonaro and Lula. He portrays himself as center left. He's actually much more center than left, and he's seen by some of these respectable forces as someone who's an alternative to both Lula and Bolsonaro.
I've been living in Brazil, except for one 5-year period, since 1991. And I remember I've accompanied Ciro Gomez's entire career. And he historically has been a little bit better than the center-right politicians that they call the Centrão in Brazil. He's maybe a little bit more historically of a Keynesian than a neoliberal. But he's like a conservative Keynesian, like a Nixon-style Keynesian or something, right? But that's still better than a neoliberal. But the problem is, I just don't trust him. He switched political parties 5 times. He was part of the Itamar Franco administration in the 90s, and he was involved in the inflation-fighting program that ended Brazil's inflation crisis called the Real Plan, which a lot of people in the mainstream media in Brazil treat like it was this wonderful thing. But essentially what it did was it created the world's highest interest rates. So even though there were other countries in Latin America that had worse inflation, like Peru, for example, Brazil entered the Guinness Book of World Records as world's highest interest rates as a result of this plan. And so that even though they went down a lot during the PT years, they're still absurdly high. Like a credit card interest rate in Brazil, an average credit card interest rate would be like 10% per month, And so this is why like the banking sector has just made a fortune in Brazil over the last 30 or 40 years. So he was involved in that. He ran for president in 2002 on this kind of center-left thing. He was in Lula's government. He was okay. Then he had a falling out with Dilma. In part because of machismo or something, but now he's working with anyone. He's one of these people, I think, who feels like he didn't get a big enough piece of the pie during the PT years, and he's really bitter against the PT. He thinks it's his turn to be president, and so he's like one of the partners he's approaching is the party that's now called Republicanos, which has changed its name a few times, but it was the Arena Party, which was the official military dictatorship party during the dictatorship years. So he's going into coalition with them. They're very right-wing. They used to be called the Liberal Front, which meant neoliberal front, right? And then another group that he's approximating now is called the Free Brazil movement, which was heavily, heavily praised in The Guardian during the lead up to the impeachment against Dilma Rousseff. They're kind of like a PR firm. Everybody in their leadership has gotten training from Atlas Foundation and Koch brothers funded. They've been up in the US in these libertarian events. They've spoken at Cato Institute. And, they were involved in a lot of very serious character assassination against Dilma Rousseff. And they're straight up libertarians. And so they're trying to organize a third path protest this Sunday. And Ciro's like, oh yeah, I'm going to go. And then they're saying, well, we're supporting Ciro now. So there's nothing center left about him. He's one of the third path guys. And the other third path guy is João Doria, the governor of Sao Paulo, who's trying to position himself as a moderate, even though he ran for governor with T-shirts that said Bolsa Doria and like screaming at his opponent in the debates, calling him a communist. When it was an ally, it's the Brazilian Socialist Party, but like in Italy and other places, sometimes the party name doesn't really correspond with reality. Brazilian Socialist Party in Sao Paulo is right wing, and they were in the ruling coalition with Doria's own political party. It was the guy he was replacing from the same party, his former vice governor. And he's just screaming in the debates, calling the guy a communist. And so he's tried to position himself as a moderate now and run for, as a third path candidate.
But on the note of like libertarian influence really quickly, I just want to point out an article that you all published at Brazil Wire. It's a great piece. Free Private Cities, Brazil's New Libertarian Dystopia, about these far-right libertarian groups with billionaire backers who are trying to privatize Brazilian cities and creating like these models for fully privatized corporate-owned cities in Brazil. And of course, they have a government that is very eager to help them in Bolsonaro's government.
Yeah, well, I think it was based on what they did in Honduras, right?
Yeah.
Didn't they do that in Honduras? Well,
another neoliberal hellscape after a U.S.-backed coup in 2009.
Thanks to Hillary Clinton, it's the most dangerous country in the world for women now.
It had the highest murder rate in the world for a few years.
Yeah, and it's depressing, but they're not going to be able to push this through. I was involved for years in the national housing rights social movements and squatters movements and stuff like that, and it just the way the Constitution's set up, they would have to make constitutional amendments to actually manage it. What they can do is privatize pieces of cities, and they do that all the time. They have these Alphaville condominium complexes, which are like separate cities inside of cities with their own police force for the rich. And ironically, they have like higher crime rates than almost anywhere because these spoiled teenagers are just doing drugs and like, breaking into other people's houses and threatening people with violence and stuff. And if the security guards try to stop them, they threaten to fire them. They said, "My dad will fire you."
My dad will fire you. Well, finally, in the last few minutes here, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the role of the CIA. I mentioned beginning this, that the CIA played a key role in the coup that ultimately overthrew the Workers' Party and installed Bolsonaro. And your colleague, Natalia Urban, a friend of the show, we've had her on here at Moderate Rebels in the Gray Zone, great journalist. She wrote this piece recently about Mr. Burns, the CIA director, took a recent trip to Bolsonaro, to Brazil to meet with Bolsonaro, rather. And we also saw another major scoop. I think that actually it was you all at Brazil Wire who broke this. And this was that a prosecutor from Lava Jato, the U.S.-backed fake anti-corruption campaign that was used as pretense for the coup, he openly said that the arrest of Lula, which prevented Lula from being a candidate in the 2018 election, was, quote, a gift from the CIA, which is pretty clearly a smoking gun in terms of CIA and U.S. involvement in the coup against the soft coup using lawfare, legal warfare against Brazil. That after Bolsonaro took power, he and his super justice minister, took a trip to Washington, and they immediately went to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, clearly to thank the CIA for installing them in power. So just as we wrap up here, I'm wondering what you think the role of these networks could be right now. I always hate in interviews when people try to ask me to tell the future, and I'm not trying to ask you to predict the future, but I'm really saying is that what kind of operations do you think are already afoot in terms of foreign meddling? Because we are talking about the Bolsonaro regime's attempt to try to do a coup, but what about foreign intelligence agencies and foreign meddling? Do you think that they will allow the election to be fair in this upcoming year?
Yeah, this is really hard to say. In terms of the CIA, that story was actually broken by Operation Spoofing. This hacker named Wagner Delgatti, who shared 3% of his hacked messages with The Intercept. They refused to accept any more of them, but Lula's defense team got a hold of all of them now. And
wait,
so
I want to clarify for people who don't know. The Intercept they refused to publish 97%.
They refused to even accept it. They wouldn't. Glenn Greenwald wouldn't even accept it. He told them that he had enough material already for like a year's worth of articles. And so then they started just leaking every week they'd have a new article from these leaked audio. But then they lost their monopoly over the information. And the Supreme Court.
But also, for people who don't know, The Intercept has a massive Brazil office. So it's pretty incredible that the big office that The Intercept has in Brazil didn't accept 97% of those messages. And again, this hacker who is responsible for that, he's actually in prison right now, right? And he'll likely be in prison for the rest of his life.
Well, I'm not sure if he's facing 300 one-year prison sentences. I'm not sure if he's actually in prison yet or if he's out on habeas corpus. The last time I heard, he was under house arrest and unable to use a computer or anything. I don't know if he's in an actual prison. Yeah, well, they didn't protect the source very well on that. But anyway, that's where the gift from the CIA, that was a leaked Telegram conversation between members of the Lava Jato task force. Now, aside from that one thing, we don't have that much information about CIA involvement. What we do have, and I've been following this, I've written over 100 articles about this, really, about U.S. Department of Justice involvement in the Lava Jato investigation. I mean, that's publicly available information that's been available on the DOJ's own website since 2016. It's been available in court documents. And in 2016, it made a lot of the Anglo media. The New York Times talked about, as part of this anti-corruption, this joint U.S.-Brazilian investigation, the Southern District New York Court has just levied the highest fine ever charged of a foreign company. They collected $3.5 billion in fines from Petrobras as part of this investigation. That's partnership between the U.S. and Brazil. And then it just disappeared from the media. For the next 3 years, if I mentioned any time, as I frequently did, that this was a partnership between the U.S. and Brazil, people would accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist. They would say that I was denying the agency of Brazilians. And all
I love
of
that.
this
My favorite line. You're denying the agency of people who are working with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's forgotten Frantz Fanon and his term international comprador bourgeoisie, or national comprador bourgeoisie. But anyway, so we have all this information about the DOJ. And then what that operation spoofing did was it showed that it revealed, and this is information that Intercept had this information, and they sat on it for nearly a year until after the COVID-19 pandemic broke, to release that that didn't even make headlines at this point, that a group of 18 FBI agents led by Leslie Bakshi's had been meeting with the Lava Jato task force every 15 days the entire time, giving them guidance on the operation. So we know that here you pulled this up. Then so then the DOJ, of that $3.5 billion they collected from Brazilian companies, they tried to give $682 million. And this is even before the Intercept broke the Telegram leaks and stuff. They tried to give, this is 2000. No, it was afterwards. So Telegram leaks. Sorry, this is 2000. I'm looking at my own date on my own article.
Yeah,
here, but
2019.
They tried to give back $682 million to the task force so that they could open a private anti-corruption NGO. And that's even
which
in
is
the
also
Bolsonaro,
that's the definition of corruption. I mean, that's like peak corruption in the name of anti-corruption. Talk about Orwellian.
They pulled Lula out of the elections because they said that after he had left office and had no more political power, he'd receive like a free $200,000 apartment upgrade. And meanwhile, they're trying to give $682 million for these guys to open a private foundation, which is illegal according to Brazilian law. It's so illegal that even the Bolsonaro administration blocked it. Bolsonaro's own appointee in the federal auditing court froze the transaction and said this money has to go into the public education system. It was so illegal that they couldn't even push it through in their own puppet regime. And it's also illegal to have informal communications between agents of a foreign government and Brazilian government officials. This is a serious crime. Communications have to go through the Foreign Affairs Office to be authorized, because it's a sovereignty issue. And so there's this speech given by the Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Blanco in 2017, bragging about how the informal communications made the process more agile. And when I published about this, I published in English and Portuguese, it led to the first motion for dismissal for illegal collaboration with a foreign government to the Lava Jato charges against Lula, which is still just bouncing around in the court system. It's already been thrown out for other reasons. But, you know, I know we're running out of time. I'm like, if we start talking about Lava Jato, I'm like Lava Jato Rain Man. I've published over 100 articles about Lava Jato.
Well, we'll have you back sometime, Brian, to talk about Lava Jato, and maybe we can do a history of U.S. meddling in that operation, because that is what installed Bolsonaro. And I think that is really going to be a model in the future for plans that future governments in the United States have for trying to carry out these kinds of soft coups through what's called lawfare, judicial warfare. Really quickly, I just want to point out that, in fact, it was the government of the current administration of the Joe Biden White House. I'm trying to find this here. Here we go. It's really incredible. And you all, actually, I saw this because Brazil Wire shared this. In a recent closed-door press conference with an unnamed top Biden administration official, with unnamed journalists, a very strange event, again, closed door, a journalist asked the top U.S. government official, the journalist said, "As you know, anti-corruption activists periodically urge the U.S. government to use its various assets and capabilities, including the intelligence community, to expose the specific cases of corruption overseas, to name and shame corrupt officials." And they asked if the new decision by the Biden White House to declare anti-corruption a new goal and declare corruption a so-called threat to U.S. national security. The journalist asked if that would be part of the Biden administration's new policy. And the unnamed senior administration official said, quote, "What I can say on that front is that the memorandum published by the Biden White House includes components of the intelligence community. So the work on that front in part remains to be seen, but they are included the Director of National Intelligence and Central Intelligence Agency." So this is as open as we're going to get of an admission by the Biden White House that the CIA, the so-called intelligence community, these spies and spooks and coup plotters, are using so-called anti-corruption efforts overseas as a pretext to carry out their operations, which is all but official admission that the operation the CIA and FBI and DOJ ran with Lava Jato in Brazil was exactly what we thought. A model that they were testing in Brazil, and now they're going to repeat in other countries overseas.
Well, they're already using Lava Jato itself all over Latin America. I mean, the Odebrecht, was used as an excuse to go after politicians in Peru, Panama.
Right now in Peru. They're doing it right now in Peru against key allies of President Pedro Castillo, including Vladimir Cerrón, who is the founder and leader of the President Castillo's party, Peru Libre, who is facing absurd lawfare attacks.
Well, this is why I know we're running out of time, but this is why every country that cares about its sovereignty should back out of the foreign corrupt practices treaties that they have. The U.S. has signed these treaties with dozens of countries, even Germany, allowing the FBI and other agents from the DOJ to operate hunting corrupt people in their own countries. They used it to go after Siemens in Germany, even. And I mean, that was the justification for walking into FIFA headquarters in Switzerland, FBI agents, and arresting a bunch of directors of FIFA in a foreign country, because Switzerland signed on to this. So any country that could, and you know what? Venezuela isn't a signatory. That's why they can't use it. They tried to use Odebrecht to go after people in the Maduro administration. Didn't work. They weren't dumb enough to sign that crap. Exactly. And neither was Cuba. And I don't think Nicaragua has either. And any of these left governments that take office should immediately get out of this.
Yeah, well, on that note, I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to end our discussion there. I was speaking with Brian Meir of Brazil Wire. That is Brasil with an S. Great website. Friends of the show. They are one of the only Latin America focused websites in English that I really highly recommend, because most of the reporting on Latin America in English is awful, and they are consistently anti-imperialist and friends of progressive movements and social movements, and they're reporting stuff in English that you never see anywhere else. So definitely check out brasilwire.com, and definitely check out Brian as well. So with that, Brian, I'll leave the last word to you if you want to plug anything before I conclude.
Well, if you look for me on Twitter, it's Brian M. Telesur. I'm also the Brazil correspondent for Telesur, and I put a few TV news stories up about what's been going on in Brasilia the last few days. And as soon as I get off the air, me and my wife are going to edit a piece about the Indigenous Women's March that happened today in Brasilia. There's a genocide going on against indigenous peoples encouraged by the Bolsonaro administration. They're international capitalist backers in the international commodities chain of soy and beef and products like that. And about 8,000 indigenous women in Brazil are marching on the Capitol right now.
Excellent. Well, you should go follow Brian over at Twitter and at Brazil Wire. Brian, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll definitely talk to you again and your friends and colleagues over there at Brazil Wire, and we'll talk to everyone next time. See ya.